Dont'e Thornton ran a 4.340. Man, it just seems like there are times that you watch the NFL Combine and you're like, man, it just doesn't seem like my school got all they possibly could have out of him. And that to me is probably troubling for most Tennessee fans. And I thought that Dont'e Thornton running the 4.3 wasn't really a surprise, but it is going to be what the H. So what the H is right now, and it's brought to you by our fantastic friends at Double D Piping. So we get to that right now. What the H is brought to you by Double D Piping.
What the H?
Wow, I've never worked hard on anything. What a cool life.
For real? The Dave Hooker Show with Caleb Calhoun. Represented by T. Scott Jones. ThanksandJones.com. Tennessee's trial attorney. From the Ted Russell Ford Lincoln Studio, East Tennessee's #1 volume and customer service dealer. Ted Russell Ford and TedRussellLincoln.net. Now to the Dave Hooker Show on Off the Hook Sports.
I was really hoping for his own sake we'd include Elijah Simmons in this What the H. But he showed up at 334. Should have showed up at about 325. And I guarantee you he would have done better than a 5.38 on his 40-yard dash. His vertical was 32, which speaks to his explosiveness. That's pretty impressive at 338 if you think 334 if you think about it, Caleb.
I agree, but I mean, the NFL looks for intangibles too, and they're going to think that he didn't take getting into shape as seriously as he should have.
No, definitely. If he shows up at 325, he may be he may be on the front of ESPN.com, right?
Yeah.
If he shows up at 325, I mean, suddenly he's a different type of player. You're thinking about a Vince Wilfork type of guy. Vince Wilfork's pretty special. That may be a reach. Okay, but what the H? Dont'e Thornton runs a what at the combine?
Dont'e Thornton ran a 4.3 flat at the combine, while at the same time drawing measurements of 6'4.5", round up to 6'5", and 215 pounds.
Okay.
Weighing.
And James Pearce did what at the combine?
So James Pearce ran a 4.47 combine, and which was incredible. Limited kind of everywhere else. James Pearce was, honestly, he didn't have the most impressive combine in a lot of ways, but his speed was just absolutely incredible and just blew everybody away.
Okay, which was the more disappointing player at Tennessee? Was it Thornton or was it Pearce?
And I phrase this as, who did Tennessee misuse more based on their combine performance, Thornton or Pearce?
Well, let's just go disappointing, because I don't know that. Well, Thornton was misused. Pearce was misused. I almost think that's equal.
Okay, so which player was more which player was more disappointing at Tennessee based on their combine performance? I'm going to say. Okay, can I say this up front? Can I be a little bit millennial, sympathetic participation trophy guy first?
Yes, lay it on me.
I don't think it's either of their faults, the level of disappointment that they had. But I think it's very clearly Dont'e Thornton, because I think Dont'e Thornton was banged up a lot of the time at Tennessee. And I think that cost him in a lot of ways. Dont'e Thornton is a speed guy, and he comes in last year hurt. By the time he gets healthy, Brew McCoy, his complimentary outside receiver, goes down for the season, and then Dont'e Thornton goes down for the season at the end of the year. They both come back this year, but Dave, here's the problem. Even with his speed, Dont'e Thornton's kind of an Alvin Harper type, right?
Yes. It's a very good comparison, because he kind of has the size and speed where some people will throw Randy Moss out there. I hate it when Randy Moss. I mean, he could run anything. He could run West Coast. He could run slants and been successful. Just happened to be really good at the go route. That's about what Dont'e Thornton is. And he's not going to win a lot of jump balls like we thought. But Alvin Harper didn't win a lot of jump balls. The former Vol, played for the Cowboys. He won a lot of passes because he was bare bleep open.
Right. Wouldn't you say Dont'e Thornton getting Bear-Bleep open was dependent on the go-to wideout being a physical, imposing presence like a Michael Irvin was back in the day, like Brew McCoy before his injury was?
Yes, theoretically, the reason that Harper was so successful, and the reason I thought Thornton would be successful, is because you would have to roll coverage to the other side, and that's really people get confused sometimes when they say your number one receiver. Your number one receiver is not necessarily your best receiver; it's the receiver that dictates coverage, and you have to roll coverage towards him.
So let's be fair.
Excuse me. I don't think anybody had a roll coverage towards Brew last year because of his lack of explosiveness. I think that they were able to play both receivers pretty straight up.
I agree. So Dont'e Thornton was more disappointing to me, but is it fair to say it wasn't his fault? Because Dont'e Thornton's profile required Brew McCoy to dictate coverage, and Brew McCoy couldn't dictate coverage. And the year before, it was Ramel Keaton, and Ramel Keaton certainly can't dictate coverage.
No.
And so with that in mind, I think Dont'e Thornton was a bigger disappointment, but I don't think it's Dont'e Thornton's fault. I think they thought they were getting – because, this 2022, let's be honest, Dave, the reason Jalen Hyatt won the Biletnikoff is because Brew McCoy was dictating coverage. Right? I mean, more than anything else.
Yes.
That's the reason he won the
question.
Biletnikoff. And you're right. Nobody was there to dictate coverage for Dont'e Thornton this year. And so Dont'e Thornton was the bigger disappointment, but I don't think it's his fault. I still break with you. I don't think James Pearce was as much of a disappointment as people think. I mean, he was still affecting plays left and right at Tennessee this past year. And we're talking about a down year where I still think he had like 7 sacks. So it's hard for me to call him a disappointment when, again, he was dictating coverage on the line. He was drawing double teams, and teams were running away from him all the time. So, I mean, James Pearce turned Joshua Josephs into an all-SEC caliber player just by his existence on the field.
Gosh, but if you're projected as the number one pick, how do you not have at least 8 to 10 sacks?
I don't think it's that. I think it's very easy to make sure a certain player doesn't get 8 to 10 sacks, honestly. I do. And also, let's base it. There's an argument, Dave, that James Pearce overachieved because look at the rest of his combine performance. It wasn't that good. His vertical wasn't good. And a lot of the other stuff he showed at the combine wasn't good. He just had a 40 time. Well, a 40 time is not going to help you get around the edge a lot of times. So, look, I'm going to be honest. I think based on their combine performances, I think Dont'e Thornton was the bigger disappointment in college. But I don't like even saying that because it wasn't his fault he was a disappointment. And James Pearce, I think James Pearce actually, to a certain level, may have overachieved. And I think it kind of validates.
Oh, come on.
I do. James Pearce is a speedster lining up at the edge rusher. He may be even a little too small for the pros sometimes. And
okay, well, we'll have to agree to disagree with that. On that, I think he was asked to drop into coverage way too much. I don't think and again, I think he had a personal issue before the season that was very serious that I'm not going to get into, but I think that was a factor as well early in the season. But why in the world was he not able to overcome that? Was he just not physically ready? That's troubling. Was he not mentally ready? I don't
think you can keep James Pearce with his hands down the whole game. I don't
understand why he was in a 4-point stance ever. I'll give you that. I mean, he either needs to be in a 2-point stance or a 1-point or a 3-point stance all the time. One hand.
I think look, and Orange Blood says it, and I kind of agree. And Dave, you may disagree with me on this, but you talk about the criticism of Leonard Little. James Pearce may be somebody you do convert to an outside linebacker, not a middle linebacker, but an outside linebacker.
I don't hate that. But really, he is an outside linebacker with his hand down more often. So it's not as if that's a reach. Timothy had this to say. Super chat goes to Quincy Calhoun's college phone. What did he say?
She says James Pearce isn't a Reggie White DN. I'll go even further, Timothy. He's not even a Derek Barnett DN. Okay, I mean he's a little slim. He's a little too slim for that. You can't keep him up on the line. So I think they had to roll him in coverage more. I think it was kind of important to disguise the defense. I think we're underrating how effective that was at times. I mean, Tennessee had one of the best defenses in college in school history this past year, doing things like that. Now, yes, the Ohio State game and the Georgia game, you got me. Defense is wilted in both of those games. Part of the reason the defense is wilted, though, is the offense wasn't really helping out. and I think we can agree on that. And so, look, and also Tim Banks wasn't willing to blitz when he should have more often in those games.
Okay, let's talk Dont'e Thornton for a second. Who was more misused? Is that our poll question, by the way?
Yeah. Well, no. Now it's who was a bigger disappointment, Thornton or Pearce.
Okay. Let's look at Thornton for a second. It seemed like because Jalen Hyatt was kind of gazelle-ish, he was a long strider. He was a bigger guy than, let's say, a Squirrel White. Normally, we think a slot guy is a smaller, right?
Right.
Okay, but Tennessee was onto something with Jalen Hyatt. They thought they could replicate that with Dont'e Thornton, and then they moved him to the outside. So here's the tough question. That is, was Dont'e Thornton more misused because they couldn't find which position they wanted him in? Or was James Pearce more misused because he was dropping into coverage, and when he was on the line, he was in a 4-point stance? Whew. That, to me, I mean, it's not often that I go right down the middle at 50-50, but you cost Thornton a year by thinking that he was a slot guy, and then you move him to the outside, so he has to learn a whole new position. And don't get me wrong, there have been offenses where you're expected to learn every position, but this is not one of those offenses. This is one of those offenses where you need to know your position. How many times did we see Brew McCoy slide inside and play slot?
Never.
No. That's just the way it is. Now, we can debate the philosophy on that, but the simple fact is that's the way it is. So let's get an update on our latest poll question. As listen, if you could convince me, James Pearce or Dont'e Thornton, who was more misused? Brought to you by Double D Fire Protection.
Double D Piping provides full-service fire protection on any scale. From residential homes to government facilities, we can assist any customer through design, fabrication, installation, inspection, and demonstration of fire suppression systems. With 30 years of service across 5 states and a full staff with over 40 years experience, our quality can't be beaten. Don't get caught watching what you could have prevented. Call Double D Piping.
Caleb, what say you, sir?
Well, okay.
It's tough. I mean,
it's tough, but
it really may be this may be the most 50-50 of any question we've asked on this show.
Yeah, but see, this is where I'm breaking with you. I'm having a hard time blaming them for either of these too much, quite honestly. Like, okay, let's take Dont'e Thornton for a minute. Dont'e Thornton's biggest problem was that he was hurt. And then he never... Let me ask you this, Dave. Give me a game where Dont'e Thornton was healthy and there was a receiver to dictate coverage on the other side that he played when he was in Tennessee.
Well, that there hasn't been, but
that's a big deal.
Well, I agree. So, who was most misused or who was most disappointing? If you want to say disappointing, if you want to change, okay.
No, that's what I said of disappointing. I think Dont'e Thornton was more disappointing, but it's not his fault.
Okay, so
but I think it was more disappointing.
That's funny. We're totally opposite. I think James Pearce was more disappointing, but I think Dont'e Thornton was more misused. And that includes dropping James Pearce into pass coverage and all that stuff.
See, I don't think Thornton was misused that much because I don't think there was any I get what you're saying, moving him to the slot and then moving him to the outside. But Dave, I don't think there was any possible way for Thornton to be there's nothing they could have done to make Dont'e Thornton effective when he was at Tennessee. For the simple fact that there was no receiver. There was never a game he played where he was healthy and then the receiver on the other side was dictating coverage. Those two things were, and those two things have to happen if Dont'e Thornton's going to be effective.
Okay, well, there was never a game called in which James Pearce was allowed to just go rabid on the other.
See, this is where you and I agree. I think dropping James Pearce back in coverage was actually effective a lot of times. I think
no. It's effective 10% of the time. It's not effective 40 to 50% of the time, which is what they did.
Okay. See, are we sure that Tennessee didn't effectively just run? We're talking about like this 4-2-5. It felt like maybe they ran more of a 3-3-5 this past year with James Pearce playing more outside linebacker than on the end sometimes.
Okay. Well, if that's the case, then he should have been taught the fundamentals of playing
linebacker,
on standing up. I mean, that's the problem I had is.
But what we're saying, basically playing with the high safeties and the stunts and the dropping him back in coverage. That's why Jalen Milroe was so awful against Tennessee. And
What's our poll question?
Who was a bigger disappointment, Dont'e Thornton or James Pearce? Thornton is winning at 81%.
Okay. I gotta be with Dylan here, man. Dylan says you don't get talked about as a first overall pick, then you can't get 10 sacks in 12 games.
That happens with defensive ends all the time.
Some of those games are Kent State and Chattanooga for the
and they're barely playing in those games because they're Kent State and Chattanooga. Okay, the only one who I ever saw get drafted because he was racking up stats against bad teams. That's what Kevin Sumlin did with Myles Garrett back in the day.
Okay, let me just throw out there. How many snaps do they play on average in the first half? 35, 40?
Probably, yeah.
45 against a Chattanooga or Kent State. Maybe they want to run up the score and look fantastic to get Josh Heupel all excited about his offensive numbers. Are you telling me that you can't get a sack in each one of those games, 2 sacks in each one of those games?
I don't think they used him a lot to get a sack in either of those games. Again, that's the thing. I remember, again, he drew so much attention. There was a commitment to teams to not let him get sacks.
Okay, but don't you owe it to some extent to James Pearce to let him roam in those games? Let him, I don't care if it's stat padding or not.
I got a question for you.
Yeah.
Because you said they did that last year. Are we sure they didn't drop him into coverage that much the year before when he did start to look like the number 1 pick? It's just his production dipped this year because teams were rolling an extra blocker over?
I didn't think they did the year before. No, I felt like when he was in the game, he was going after the passer, and that's what showed up to NFL scouts.
Okay, but I mean, he also got a pick 6 in the Citrus Bowl.
Well, you know, I mean, he could be at the right place at the right time. Maybe that was the fool's gold that they saw. Maybe they saw that interception. They're like, hey, we can really surprise people because he can drop into coverage.
I mean, it seemed to work against Alabama. I'll just say that. I mean, basically Tennessee turned Jalen Milroe. Jalen Milroe went from a first-round draft pick to this guy will be a bust in the NFL solely based on what Tennessee did to him in that game. They basically laid a blueprint to show that Jalen Milroe will never make it in the NFL.
Okay. Listen, sounds like a lot of people agree with me. Travis says Caleb is a professional excuse maker.
Oh, okay. Is that where we're going? All right. Okay. I'm a professional caveat adder. How about that?
Yeah. By the way, but Daniel says Caleb knows his, I don't know if I can say that word on the YouTube, but
thank you, Daniel. Thank you. And you share a last name with the greatest control pitcher in the history of baseball.
Is that right?
Greg Maddux.
Okay. Now, Todd is calling me out, and I appreciate it. I do. He played 10 snaps against bad teams. 10 snaps. Come on, Dave.
They were hardly playing him. Yeah.
I'd play him 20.
By the way, that's where college football's so different now, because everybody says you can't take stats as much into account because they play more games. But you know this, Dave, back in the day, like let's say like 1995 when you were covering Tennessee, the starters were still playing the bulk of the snaps even against the bad teams, weren't they?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to combine Todd and Dylan's point because here's my point. Todd, he did play 10 snaps against bad teams. You should play 20 to 25 snaps against bad teams. They are, as a whole, this program is too soft and it's too protective of its players. They don't allow fighting in practice. They don't have physical practices. Yeah, Dylan says, I'll compromise that Pearce drew a lot of attention and dropped into coverage. But Pearce also had quarterbacks dead to rights and straight up missed the sack. You know how you avoid that? It's more physical practices and more real game time snaps. So what is the question? Is the question the bigger disappointment, or is the question the most misused? Because there are two different answers, in my opinion.
The question right now is the bigger disappointment. I just have a hard time believing Thornton was misused, but right now the question is the bigger disappointment.
He came in the house as a slot.
I still think he could have worked out as a slot if he had a guy to dictate coverage on the outside. I mean, I think Thornton could play the slot or as the number 2 guy on the other side. I think he could have done either.
Okay. I guess we'll agree to disagree. Caleb's a pretty smart cat, so I'll probably question myself a little bit later and think about it, but man,